So nice to see all of you here. I know we're packed today. I know I poked my head in platinum seating, and there's people crammed in there. Thank you all so much for your long-suffering sitting in platinum like that. We appreciate that. You're first to the buffet, by the way, so let you know that. Others are in other places, Twinkles and other places watching, and all of you who are here, thank you so much for coming today. You know, how a person dies can often tell you more about that person than how they live. Did you know that? Death has a way of revealing who we really are. Think, for example, of someone like Socrates, or maybe Joan of Arc, or maybe the great Christian dissident in Germany in World War II, Dietrich Bonhoeffer. All good examples of that. How about Jesus? Now, as if his life did not speak volumes enough about his character and purpose, the way Jesus died reveals even more about who he is. As a matter of fact, best-selling author Max Lucado, in one of his most famous books, 6 Hours, One Friday, has actually summed that up for us. Look, Lucado says, when a man knows the end is near, only the important surfaces. Impending death distills the vital. The trivial is bypassed, the unnecessary overlooked. That which is vital remains. So if you would know Christ, ponder his final days. Good advice. And that's what we've been doing in recent weeks. Those of you who've been with us, we've been in a series called The Week That Changed the World, which is a look at the last 7 days of Jesus. And so we've kind of walked with Jesus through his time in Jerusalem in what's called Passion Week, or Easter Week. And we've seen all the different things, coming into Jerusalem, the triumphal entry. We've seen the cleansing of the temple. We've seen his teaching. We've seen silent Wednesday when he was betrayed and yet anointed at Bethany. And then last week we talked about the events of Thursday, the Last Supper, the Garden of Gethsemane, and then the arrest. And that's where we left Jesus last week. And now today we've come to Friday, the day of Jesus' death. And we want to look closely at this extraordinary death. Because as someone has observed, Jesus died like no man who has ever lived. As a matter of fact, the brilliant philosopher Rousseau, 18th century, once said, Socrates lived and died like a philosopher. Jesus lived and died like a god. And that's from a man who was not known for his spirituality. Yet he understood the remarkable life and death of Jesus. And so that's what we want to do today. We'll move rather quickly because we have a lot to cover, because it was an incredibly packed day with all kinds of difficult, hard to see and think about things, but we need to look at them, because obviously what we want to do is to get ready for what? For Sunday. Because obviously the focal point of Jesus' death is the fact that he didn't stay dead. That 3 days later he rose again. And he did it in such spectacular fashion. It wasn't like he was just kind of a shadowy figure kind of slipping through, the darkness. He literally came alive for a month and appeared vividly to people. It wasn't like somebody squinting through the sun. Oh, I think that's Jesus up on the hill. Hey, guess what? He's alive. Come on, let's go start a religion. It wasn't like that. That's not how it happened. Jesus appeared to thousands of people over this period of time, 500 at one time. He walked with them. He talked with them. He taught them things that he had not taught before. It was spectacular. And then in front of their very eyes, he ascended into the clouds into heaven. That's dramatic. These were eyewitnesses. These were not people who expected him to come back to life. These were people who had to be convinced he had come back to life. And some of them were even his family, who at that time, before the resurrection, didn't believe in him. Matter of fact, there was a couple of passages in the New Testament where they actually thought he was crazy. And they tried to get him to come home. Come home to Nazareth. You're going to get killed doing what you're doing. You're crazy. But ultimately, they found out it was them who was crazy, because Jesus was exactly who he said he was. But anyway, I get ahead of myself. If you can't come on Sunday, at least do me this. Come next Friday, would you? Maybe this is your first Friday, or you've ever come or something. Well, at least come one more. Come next week, because we're going to talk in great detail about the resurrection of Jesus. And perhaps you'll hear things you've never heard before. But anyway, let's get started talking about the death of Jesus Christ and how it transpired. The crucifixion and burial. And it can essentially, even though, as I said, it's a very busy day, it can kind of be broken down into four ways, four things. There's the trials, 6 of them, Mark doesn't include all 6. He just kind of includes part of 2, actually, and covers them very well. Mark is, if you've never read it, is the shortest of the Gospels, only 16 chapters. And as a result, he's very Spartan with his words. Writing to a Roman audience primarily, they were not people who liked long oration. So Mark, as a result, reflects that. And it's, if you want to just read one gospel and you don't have much time, that's the one to read. Following the trials, Jesus is flogged and abused. Then there's the crucifixion from 9 in the morning till 3 in the afternoon. And 3 o'clock in the afternoon is when he died. And then he hung on the cross for a while before they could get permission to take his body down in the burial. And that's where we'll end today. A couple of things to let you know about the 6 trials. There were first 3 religious trials and 3 civil trials. As I said, Mark doesn't include all the details. If you want to know more, then you need to go to the other Gospels. That's Matthew, Luke, and John. Might be a good thing this weekend or to read and kind of catch up and see the story behind Mark. But the other Gospel writers give you great detail of those trials and what happens. But essentially, Jesus is taken to Annas, who is not the previous high priest. He's the older, wiser. He's kind of the mafia don, if you would, who's in charge of the whole crowd. And then Caiaphas, who's the current high priest, is actually his son-in-law. And that's who Mark writes about, that Jesus goes to see the current high priest, Caiaphas, kind of blends that together. Then ultimately, because the Jews didn't have capital punishment power, they had to go see the Roman governor, who was Pilate, who normally lived in Caesarea, which was a few miles on the Mediterranean. But because it was Passover and therefore a heightened time of insurrection and problem, Pilate had brought his Roman soldiers with him, and they had come and were staying in Jerusalem for this. So they go see Pilate, and Pilate then actually sends Jesus to Herod Antipas, one of the sons of Herod the Great, who was ruling in Galilee at the time. Herod didn't want to have anything to do with him, sends him back. Ultimately, Pilate, kind of almost under derision, goes ahead and sentenced Jesus to be first flogged, or scourged, as it's called, and then crucified. And the group that Jesus appeared before, this, by the way, is a picture of Jerusalem. Get an idea of where these things took place. I have a pointer up here, and you'll see that this is essentially looking east. It's the direction we're looking towards. North to our right, south to our left. Here's Gethsemane, where Jesus was arrested, on the Mount of Olives. They would have brought him across the Kidron Valley into the upper city. This is the wealthier area, and this is where the house of Caiaphas is located. We've actually found that house archaeologically, and actually can take you to the very spot where Jesus' first trial took place. Then they went, and Annas and Caiaphas lived in essentially the same large house. Then over to see Pilate, then over to see Herod, who was in this fortress here, back to Pilate, ultimately to the Fortress Antonio, where the Roman soldiers had at him, and then walking through the streets of Jerusalem and out of the city gates to the place of Golgotha, which means the skull. It's called Calvary. That's where we get the Latin word, comes from the Latin word cranium, meaning looks like a skull. That's where we get the English word Calvary. But in Aramaic, it was Golgotha, which is for skull. Jesus appeared before a group called the Sanhedrin. These were the people, the Jewish people, that he appears before first. They were kind of like the Senate and the Supreme Court combined. They were made up of several different factions. Sadducees, who were very wealthy, Pharisees, who were very conservative, scribes, who were very scholarly, and elders, who were very respected. All of these men came together in order to hear and try Jesus. First of all, these trials were a complete mockery. The Sanhedrin had very strict laws about when and when they could not meet. So here they were meeting in the middle of the night. That was illegal. They were meeting in a private home. They were supposed to be meeting in the temple. They were taking a testimony that was based on bribery, which was absolutely incorrect. And then they were bringing a false charge. This thing that the high priest says, that you said you would tear down the temple, which of course would be a terrible rebellious act, to destroy the beautiful temple, which was the center of their worship. Jesus never said that. What he said was, in John chapter 2, 3 years earlier, at the very beginning of his ministry, he cleansed the temple. He did it twice, once at the beginning, once at the end. And after he did it the first time, the religious leaders came to him and said, by what authority do you do this? Give us a sign that we would know that you have the authority to do this. And Jesus said, a sign's coming. It is that one day, this temple, meaning the temple of his body, will be destroyed, and I will raise it up in 3 days. He wasn't talking about the physical temple at all. Completely twisted his words around. Completely. It's fascinating, though, that it took them, they've been thinking about that for 3 years. Finally, they got him on that. Of course, one of the other things I find interesting, the second thing is the fact that when the high priest couldn't get the testimony in agreement, here they paid these guys, they still couldn't get him to agree. Oh, I think he said this. No, I think he said that. I think he was over there. No, he was over here. They couldn't get him to agree at all. So finally, the high priest just comes right out and asks Jesus, are you the Christ, the Messiah, the promised one, the Redeemer, the Deliverer? Are you the Son of the Blessed One? Only place that ever occurs in the New Testament. High priest used that unique word, Blessed One, a reference to God. Are you the Christ who's come from God? And what did Jesus say? I am. Maybe you've heard before that Jesus never claimed to be God or never claimed to be the Messiah. That's absolutely false. If anyone's ever told you that, tell them they just need to go read the New Testament. As a matter of fact, Jesus said it several times during his ministry. Numerous times, he actually admitted it to Pilate as well in the little exchange he had with Pilate, which is not shown in Mark. It's mentioned in one of the other Gospels. And then Jesus said, not only did he say I am, but he said, one day you will see me coming in glory. And he quotes from Psalm 110 and from Daniel 7, which were clearly passages dealing with the Son of God who was to come. So Jesus did not back up. I mean, he knew what needed to happen, and if they couldn't get any false testimony, he was going to give them all the evidence they needed. Last thing is, one of the things, if you read the other Gospels, you'll see is that Jesus was much more brutally treated here than Mark mentions. Obviously, they blindfolded him, they were tormenting him, they were battering him. But the other Gospels include the fact that he was struck many times. When he was taken to Herod, one of Herod's guards struck Jesus with a blow that nearly brought Jesus to his knees. So the religious leaders had their evidence. Now they were going to even go and lie about it. They were going to say that Jesus was a rebel, an insurrection. This was religious. This wasn't civil. But they were going to turn it into something that Pilate could be concerned about because they wanted to get him to condemn Jesus to death. Several things I'd like to comment on, but due to time, let me just mention a couple. One is that Jesus did and said more on the cross than Mark includes. Mark only includes 2 statements from the cross. In reality, Jesus spoke 7 times from the cross. And again, if you want to go to the other Gospels, Matthew, Luke, and John, you can read about those other things. I mean, again, Jesus was on the cross for 6 hours. This was not a short time. By crucifixion standards, he died pretty quickly. Sometimes people could last 2 or 3 days on the cross. That all kind of depended on how they crucified them, what they gave them a little seat to sit on, which they did if they wanted to prolong it. But with these men, apparently they didn't. They wanted the death to happen quickly before the end of the day. Another thing is the temple curtain. Maybe that would be confusing to you. Essentially, in the temple, we've shown pictures of it the last several weeks. There on Temple Mount, there was the white actual temple building. And at the very back of that building was the most sacred, holy of all places. It was called the Holy of Holies. And it was a place where the mercy seat was. And no one would go in there except the high priest once a year, when he would go in to sprinkle the blood of a lamb on that mercy seat, and the sins of the people would be forgiven for another year. And there was an enormous a curtain that hung in front of it, massive curtain, as big as this black curtain behind me. And it was as thick as a man's hand, layer upon layer of heavy drapery. And so, I mean, it was really almost impenetrable. And so for that curtain to split in two at the time of Jesus' death and fall open was clearly a symbol of what? Whereas before, coming to God to have your sins forgiven was something that took the sacrifice of animals and the following of the Levitical law. But now what? There's an open pathway that's been provided by Jesus for each of us to be able to come to the Holy One God and have our sins forgiven through the sacrifice of Jesus. What a great, amazing visual aid. When they took Jesus to the Roman soldiers, when Pilate finally kind of begrudgingly, because I think he's really, and again, if you read the Gospel of John and see the interaction between Pilate and Jesus, he didn't really think that Jesus had done anything worthy of crucifixion. But in order to placate the religious leaders, which he was under orders to do, and again, you can study history and find out about it, he kind of was caught in a difficult place. So he went along and agreed for this crucifixion to take place. And he sent Jesus to be scourged or flogged, hoping at first that would take care of it. And he actually brought Jesus back after the scourging and said, "Behold this man, look what we've done to him." But still it wasn't enough. They still wanted him crucified. And so when Jesus was taken to where the Roman soldiers were, to the palace or the praetorium as they called it, did you notice what Mark says? And the other gospel writers verify this. They called all of the Roman soldiers together, all the company. That was a cohort, is the word that's used in Scripture. It means that's 1/10 of a legion. That's 600 men. This wasn't 4 or 5 guys just, having lunchtime sport with Jesus. This was hundreds of men gathered around him, screaming, yelling, drinking, looking for something to do, nothing better than to torture this stupid Jew who happens to have claimed that he's something special. We'll show him just how special he is. According to what we know of Roman crucifixion, and again, they were amazing at it, they would have stripped Jesus naked. That's why later they had to give him his clothes back. Did you hear that? They gave him his clothes and dressed him in order that he could walk the cross to Calvary. And so Jesus would have been naked during this flogging that went on, and many historians believe probably sexually abused as well, which is hard to think about, the Son of God being treated in that way. But there's a verse in Hebrews that says Jesus endured everything that we've endured. So maybe you've been treated badly, horribly. Maybe you've been abused. Jesus understands. He was too. Crucifixion itself, let's talk a little bit about it. It was absolutely, unbelievably horrendous. The most painful and torturous method of execution ever used, bar none. I think most all historians agree to that. It was devised by the Persians about 600 BC. They actually started by staking people, driving a stake, putting them on a stake, and then eventually figured out that they could last longer if they nailed them to the wood. It was spread by Alexander the Great. When he conquered the Persians, he thought it was a great idea, so he began to use it for his enemies. And then, of course, eventually he taught it to the people in Carthage, and then the people in Carthage taught it to the Romans, who became the masters of it. I mean, they developed it to a fine science. They had about 4 different ways of crucifying people, all depending on who they were, what they'd done, how long they wanted them, how much time they had. I mean, it's a sick science, designed to inflict maximum amount of pain in the longest period possible. It was illegal, by the way, to use on a Roman citizen. That's how hideous the Romans considered it. It was only something you could use on non-citizens. And even then, it was safe for the worst of criminals. Jesus was crucified because the religious leaders demanded it, but not only that was the right sentence for someone who was guilty of insurrection, which is essentially what they charged him with. And it's possible the 2 men on either side, even though through years we've always called them the thieves that Jesus was, and you can translate that Greek word as thieves, but you can also translate it as rebel. And many people think that these guys were probably in cahoots with Barabbas, the zealot, the true insurrectionist, who the crowd, demanded to be set free instead of Jesus. I read something the other day which said, if you ask the crowd, they will always request Barabbas. Boy, that's really insightful, isn't it? And anyway, they crucified Jesus in this hideous way, and they used this, the Romans did actually, as kind of a state terrorism. They would do this in a public place. So if you go to, back to that map I showed you, and if you go out that gate to the northwest, essentially, it was one of the most public gates in all Jerusalem. And there's a little bend in the road there, and that's where that hill and quarry was. And there was a lovely little high place there that nobody could miss. And they said, hey, this is where we'll execute people right here. And so they would have driven those stakes in the ground, those upright beams, and they would have stayed there all the time. And you can imagine, they call it the place of the skull. Some people think because the hill looked like a skull. Other people think simply because there were so many skulls there. And the Romans loved to collect skulls at these places, stack them up. Kind of like, counting trophies. But it was a public place where everybody could see. That's why so many people, that's what they wanted to do. That was the whole purpose of it. Now, there's a lot of paintings. You've probably seen them. I've seen them. Depictions in movies and other things. How many movies, maybe, if you've seen of religious movies? And one of the things that always bothers me about them is, even though I love this painting, it's one of my favorite paintings by a painter named Karl Bloch. It's absolutely, from the standpoint of the way it's arranged, the colors, I've seen this painting in the museum, and it is, you can hardly take your eyes off of it. It is a thing of beauty, but it's missing something that it really needs to have. And what's it's missing? Can you see what's missing? Where's the blood? Where's the blood? One of the things that people who are eyewitnesses to scourging and crucifixions wrote about was the massive amounts of blood. It's hard to imagine how much blood is really in the human body until you see it all spilled out in front of you. And the people who experienced crucifixion would have been covered in blood. Probably the way Jesus was crucified was more in line with this famous artist Gay in his picture Crucifixion. You can see that it was probably just the crossbeam or the taw cross, not the big. The wood was very precious in the time of Christ, Josephus tells us. They wouldn't have been able to have had these massive crosses. So probably they had a lower cross with just the crossbeam. They would have tacked up above the crossbeam the thing about the statement that Jesus was the King of the Jews. Also, the crosses would have been lower because the Romans liked to be able to look into the eyes of the men and see how they were doing and torment them. If they lifted up and gave him wine, it's probably because the Romans were sitting on the ground when they lifted up to offer him the wine. And the wine they offered him, by the way, when he got to Golgotha, was not an act of kindness. That was actually wine vinegar mixed with myrrh, the gospel writers tell us. Historians tell us that what it was kind of like a semi-narcotic that they would give the men when they first got there in order to put them into kind of a daze. So when they laid them down and actually drove the spikes into them, they wouldn't fight them so much. And then they could put them up on the cross. It would cause them to last longer. And when that wore off, you can imagine how the pain would rush in and suddenly hit them. And the Romans would just laugh. They thought that was absolutely delightful. Jesus probably was crucified something more in this fashion. One of the reasons we know that is because in 1968, in the northwestern part of Jerusalem, some graves were uncovered. And in one of those graves was an ossuary, a bone box. And in that bone box, there was a ankle of a man who'd been crucified. It's the only bones we have of any man who's been crucified, even though we know there were thousands and tens of thousands of men crucified during this time. And the reason we don't have any more bones is because they would leave them on the crosses and not take them down. And because the crosses were low, that was perfect because the birds of prey could come and then the wild animals could come and feed on them. And so usually there were no bones left because they were all drug off somewhere and buried. But this particular man, who was in his 20s and lived about the time of Jesus, apparently was from a wealthy enough family, a respected enough family, they were able to get his body off the cross, and they were able to bury it in the traditional way. But it's interesting because one of the ankles has a spike driven through it, and apparently it hit a knot in the wood and bent, so they couldn't get it out of the ankle. And so they had to bury the man with the spike in his ankle, which eventually, of course, what we have is just the ankle bone. It's very possible that that would mean that he was crucified in the fashion that we see in this picture. The flogging that Jesus endured before he went to the cross, or scourging as it's called, was hideous in and of itself. Basically what they did was they took the prisoner, again, they would strip him naked, they would fasten him by metal handcuffs to a post and either stretch him over it or at least have him hang from it, and then they would take this whip called a flagrum, and they would go after him with it. And the flagrum was usually had leather strips anywhere from 6 to 9, and embedded in the leather were pieces of sheep bone, lead, and glass. And sometimes there would even be hooks on the end of the leather, so that as they whipped the man, they'd be able to rip open the flesh, which was the whole point, which was to weaken him. So otherwise he might last 9 or 10 days on the cross, and who had time for that? So we want to let him bleed out as much as we can before we get him to the cross. As a matter of fact, Josephus, again, one of the historians, talks about witnessing a scourging where he said, I actually saw the backbone of the person. He writes this thing. It was a horrendous, horrendous experience. This is what Jesus experienced before he ever got to the cross. No wonder he collapsed under the weight of the crossbeam as he was carrying it. And by the way, did you notice what Mark said? He said there was a man by the name of Simon Cyrene. That means he was from the area of Libya. That's a city in Libya. And it even gave his sons, and his 2 sons, Alexander and Rufus. We believe, and church history would seem to back up, that Simon, who was apparently there for Passover, maybe he'd even come from Libya for Passover, it says he was from the country, and he happened to just be coming in the gate right as they were going out. Jesus collapsed. Roman soldiers didn't want Jesus to die there. They wanted to get him on the cross, so they picked someone out of the crowd. Hey, you, come here. Pick this up. And the man did. Carried it to Golgotha, and then apparently stayed and watched Jesus die. And he came to the same conclusion that the Roman centurion did. This man was not just any man. This man was the Son of God, and apparently became a believer, and his sons believers, because Paul even mentions one of his sons in the book of Romans. What did Jesus look like after the flogging? Probably more like this than that pleasant picture that we may have seen elsewhere. Jesus would have been bloody from head to toe. He would have been in agony before they ever put him on the cross. What did he experience on the cross? Well, there's a famous article written by Dr. William Edwards some years ago where he talks about the physical effects of crucifixion. It's quite a long article. I won't give you all the gory details, but he lists a number of symptoms that someone would experience on the cross: dizziness, nausea, raging thirst, high fever. You would be, again, naked on the cross. You would have been incontinent, which means you would have been urinating and defecating. It would have been horrendous. Shame, the humiliation. That's what the Romans wanted. Suffocation, panic attacks, pain off the scale, burning sensation raging through your body, barely able to breathe. In order to breathe, you had to pull yourself up through your impaled hands, which would have been, the spike would have been through the wrist, not through the palm. Those would have torn out. But between the two bones, right there, they would have put the spike. So you would have to pull yourself up in order to get a breath and then come back down. So you had to push up on your feet, hold up with your hands and breathe, and then come back down. So really, most people normally died of suffocation when eventually the pain just got so great, or they would pass out from the pain and unable to breathe. They would suffocate as a result. Many, many more symptoms. Horrendous, unbelievable what he went through. Here's a question I have for you. Why the cross? Why not send Jesus at some other time period? Some other time when he could have, I don't know, drank hemlock like Socrates, or, been in front of a firing squad, or had his head cut off, or been thrown off a cliff. Why the cross? Now, there's some wonderful theological reasons about crosses, what cross represents and how we are crucified with Christ. Those are great answers, but the two answers that probably mean the most to me are this. Number one, it was the cross because God wanted to show the enormity of our sin. The cross is an unforgettable reminder how seriously God takes sin and the extent he himself was willing to go to eliminate it from our lives and from our eternity. Is your sin which separates you from God today a serious thing? Yeah, serious enough that God used the cross in order to remove it. The other thing is, I think the cross is an amazing, amazing statement of the unconditional love that God has for each of us. Jesus died horrendously, horribly, painfully, agonizingly. He died excruciatingly. Do you know where the word excruciate comes from? It's from the Latin word, which means from the cross. That's where the word excruciate comes from. I think that the love of God is so beautifully expressed in the cross, and it's spelled out in the Word of God. John writes, you want to know real love? This is real love. Not that we love God, but that he loved us and sent his Son to bear the full wrath of our sin. And then Jesus himself in John 3, very famous verse, for God loved the world so much that he gave his only Son so that whoever believes in him shall not be lost. Let me ask you today, are you still lost? If so, realize what Jesus did to achieve the forgiveness of sin in your life and my life. I don't know how many of you know this person, Kenneth Clark. Ever heard of him? Some of us who are a little older know. He was quite famous years ago. He was, as you can see, was a British lord, but he was a museum curator, a brilliant scholar, great art person. One of the things that got me interested in art was his program. And he was just a remarkable man. And he had a series called Civilization, which was a multi-period series that was on a TV a good bit, and it was just fascinating. He literally covered all the different time periods of history, and just a brilliant, brilliant man. But tragically, Kenneth Clark was not a believer in Christ and died not being a Christian. And in his autobiography, he mentions that once he was visiting a beautiful church where he saw a painting of the sacrifice of Christ that overwhelmed him. And he says, I began to think perhaps he did that for me. And he writes, there was an irradiation, kind of a heavenly joy, far more intense than anything I'd ever known, that filled my being. But then he writes, the gloom of grace descended. He said, that's the problem, the gloom of grace, you see. Because if I allow myself to be influenced by this, then I would have to change, and my family might think I'd lost my mind. And maybe that intense joy would prove to be an illusion. So I concluded I was far too deeply embedded in the world to change my course. Kenneth Clark saw what we saw, but he turned and walked away. How did Jesus die? He died alone. His disciples all betrayed him. Jesus knew they would. He still chose them. Jesus knows that we will betray him and still he chooses us. He died silently. Jesus died quietly. Only a couple of times did he admit who he was. And the reason is because he wanted to go to the cross. He did not want to get off. He came for that purpose, to die. And now this thing he'd been waiting for his whole life is finally here. Certainly he wasn't going to try to talk his way out of it. He died like a lamb, the sacrificial lamb that he was, did not open his mouth. He died courageously, incredibly courageously. The fact that he refused the narcotic when they wanted to offer it to him, the fact that he told the high priest, yes, I am that person. I mean, that's incredible. He did not back away. He faced the cross with courage, just like he calls on us to face our problems in the same way. Jesus died with compassion. Can you imagine that he prayed for his executioners? Have you ever heard of anything like that? How could a man, it says in Luke 23, that Jesus said, Father, forgive them, for they know not what they're doing. How could he do that? Especially when he had the power to change it. I mean, he could have called angels to come and deliver him. As a matter of fact, when Peter cuts off the ear of the servant of the high priest in the garden, you remember what happened? Jesus stops everything. He says, no, this is not the way this is not right. He who uses the sword will die by the sword. And he picks up the ear and actually heals the man. And then he makes this remarkable statement. He says, do you not think I cannot appeal to my Father, and he will at once put at my disposal 12 legions of angels? That's 12,000 angels. In the Old Testament, one angel in one night kills 44,000 Assyrian soldiers ready to assault Jerusalem. What do you think 12,000 angels could have done to have gotten him out of the garden? But no. He had compassion. And finally, he died promising that he would return. Over and over again, Jesus said the same thing. Here in Mark 10, it's about, probably 2 months before the events we're reading about. Jesus actually goes point by point with the disciples. Says, listen, we're going to Jerusalem, and here's what's going to happen. Bang, da bang, da bang, da bang. This is what they're going to do. They're going to mock me. They're going to deliver me. The Gentiles are going to do this to me. They're going to spit on me. They're going to scourge me. Ultimately, they're going to kill me. But guess what? The Son of Man will rise again. Amazing. Jesus died knowing he was going to rise again. The end of Friday is the burial. They take Jesus down from the cross. There's a man named Joseph of Arimathea who's actually a part of the Sanhedrin, a respected part. So there were some who were already beginning to believe. More would follow later. They ask for the body of Jesus. Pilate allows it. They take it down, but it's late. It's 6 o'clock, Mark says. And so they have to hurriedly lay it in a tomb. That's not right, because they've got to treat the body with spices and wrap it so that they can come back later and gather the bones and put in the ossuary. So they're going to have to leave it for now, but they'll come back as soon as the Sabbath's over. And of course, that's where we're going to pick up the story Sunday morning or next Friday, if you can join us. How do we respond to this? Well, let me suggest this. I would say the trial of Jesus continues even to this day. By the way, that's John Stott's line. Don't let me take credit for it. In the hearts and minds of many people, people ask, who is Jesus? Where did he come from? Why did he come? Who is it he says he is? Is he that person? Did he really rise from the dead? And listen, the answers we give to those questions will determine our eternal destiny. Think long and hard about what you've seen today. There's simply too much evidence to ignore Jesus. If you are a follower of Christ, then let me encourage you, take a few minutes to really think about this. Don't let this just be another sermon. Stop and think about it. And then on the way out, there's a lovely white cross with these pieces of red paper. And you can pick up a piece of paper and write on it what the cross means to you and stick it on that cross. That can be a really good thing to do for you and for the people who will read those later. Let's pray together. I have a prayer that I'm going to pray, and you may be ready to pray this. If you are, please do. If not, you can maybe pray it later or come and see me. I'd love to talk with you about this. But you can put this in your own words. The prayer goes like this. Dear God, for the first time, I realize all that Jesus suffered for me. He allowed himself to be tortured and crucified in order that I might be forgiven. God, the price is too great. The pain is too much. Now I begin to understand how awful my sin is, and I begin to realize how great your love is for me. Today, on this anniversary of Jesus' death, I surrender my whole self to you. Come into me and take charge of me. I have a lot to learn, but I know where to start. At the cross of Jesus.